Thank you very much, Liz. It's a great pleasure to come and speak in these fora that Liz organizes. This was the second time I've come from Singapore for a 10-minute presentation, so I insisted this time that I have a paper and I will willingly put down my neck as the sacrificial victim for people to challenge me on this more elaborate presentation. I should also mention though Liz has indicated as such, that I'm a historian and this is not my research project. I am very interested in contemporary and modern India-China events, more from the perspective in my role, as she also pointed out, as a director of many organizations, and it's really about trying to think of issues of comparability and promoting the study of India-China things. So what I will talk about, and I have no more than half an hour, so is this presentation that you see before you, which was finished late, just before lunch today, Rural Society, which I forgot to put my name, Rural Society and the Promise of Citizenship, China and India, 1950. So the idea is to really consider problems of comparability, consider problems of what kinds of directions might we think, and also survey this whole period to see precisely those problems of comparability and the problems of goals of our research when we try to understand these societies. We can try and understand them from various perspectives, from business perspectives, from their impact in the future. But I think this is an issue that a lot of us started with, that these had huge agrarian populations, these societies, that seemed to be nowhere near the threshold of modern society as we thought of it, not in 1950, but not too much after that. And there was all this promise for them, so where have they come? Okay, what should I use? Just the, okay. Ooh. That's very small. I can't read it myself. So the goal is to construct a comparative narrative to discuss the different modes of inclusion and exclusion of rural society in the national quest for prosperity, security, and citizenship, right? So there is, I think, a fair amount of comparability in the two societies, because if you look at the starting point, and there are also sufficient parallels, I think, to merit comparative analysis, because of, I see common initial conditions, which are the starting point. The convergent, if you'll also notice, and I'm noticing this more and more, there are the points at which they begin to transform or change or take certain directions, often are because of geopolitical factors, and also because of the kinds of circulating global discourses, you know, whether it is neoliberalism or redistributive justice or whatever. They sort of come to both societies at comparable times. So the research question is that you have these common imperatives at various times, but how are they addressed and dealt with? So what are the differences in this case? So to look at the starting point, overwhelmingly agriculture in 1950, and by 2010, 45% of the Chinese labor force remains in agriculture. So there's still a very large number, contributing 12% to the GDP, whereas in India, 55% remain in agriculture, contributing 18%. Now, if you look at 1950, or earlier really, in the late 40s, and you think of some of the great leaders in India and China, Mao and Gandhi, you see that they had two types of goals that were not necessarily in contradiction, but could be. They were probably more in contradiction in the case of Gandhi, but ultimately also, I think, in Mao. They are the goals of restoration, that is to say that there was something fundamentally moral about peasant society. They had certain community relationships and so on. And these need to be restored at some level. And the other was, of course, redistributive, which is you can't sort of operate in the present state. They have to be, some kind of balance has to be created between property ownership and so on. So it's easier to understand the restorative elements in someone like Gandhi, who talks very unashamedly about a kind of romantic ideal, the Ram Rajya, the kingdom of Rama, and peasants living an ideal life, very closely tied to nature and spirituality. But how about Mao? I have argued at different points that Mao too actually has a very fundamentally communitarian notion of peasant society. Once you get rid of the class enemies and these kinds of problems, and this is artistically often also depicted, right? That there is a moral solidarity that exists among peasants. And we've got to remove all of these kinds of things. So there is a strong restorative order, but of course for Mao, the revolutionary transformation was just as important in order to get to that kind of ideal. And so this idea of poor and blank peasants formed the basis of a deep and originary, albeit eroded communalism. But, and this also, of course, represented the ideological basis of collectivization and Great Leap Forward and so on. But of course, there were other leaders in the Communist Party and the Congress which were much more inclined towards the strongly redistributive angle and seeking to give them land rights and give them citizenship rights in a modern sense. And for them, the very important thing was land reform, justice for the dispossessed, and right of the citizen to livelihood. Ownership could be by individual or collective ownership, right? I mean, the question of rights also applies to collective ownership. And as the communists recognized very early that you couldn't, especially from the Soviet experience, that you couldn't increase wealth just with individual ownership. So that was to be a transitory stage. You had to move to collective ownership. Okay. So the early phase of reforms, 50s to 80s. In China, I don't want to go into this. Most of you know it. I'm sure even the India scholars know the whole process of land reform and collectivization is basically concluded with relatively little disruption, except for death of a lot of people in land reform, by 1956. In India, actually, what is less known is that there was also considerable effort made in the first 5-year plan, and you have 55.3% of the budget was spent on agriculture, I mean, which is a huge amount. Land laws allowing the enlargement of the basis of land ownership were in fact implemented. In fact, there's some, I mean, although it's not comparable, but India probably redistributed more land than Korea, Taiwan, and Japan altogether. So during that first 5-year plan and during the 50s. 40% of the land came to be owned by direct producers, while over 12 million tenant farmers acquired secure rights over 4.4% of the arable land. Tenant holdings gradually declined until the 1990s, but 33%, or roughly 70 million of the agricultural workforce of 242 million, was classified as casual wage laborers. So things were still pretty bad in that same period. After the mid-50s, both societies see agricultural investment as a drain on resources for industrialization. Both the CCP and the Congress become committed to heavy industrialization. So this is, of course, something that this is very much part of global discourse, and particularly global socialist discourse. This is something that the Chinese Communist Party learned from the Soviet Union. This is what is known as primitive capital accumulation in the Marxist language. And that, in fact, you don't have imperialism to get capital resource for industrialization. You've got to take it from the peasants. And in China, you never had more than 8% of gross capital formation in agriculture till the 1980s. And it's also very interesting that in 1955, several teams of Indian teams visit, including Saha and people, visit the Chinese agricultural scene, and they too are impressed by how much increases in production and satisfaction in life. And 55, 56 were good years in China, were impressed by how they were able to do this with a minimum diversion of capital to agriculture. Okay, heavy industry and the problems of low investment and weak reform. So having done that and having reduced capital investment in agriculture, they look at different means to generate wealth, if not wealth, at least improvements in agricultural life and the quality of life, without diverting too much needed capital for heavy industry. Note, by the 60s, of course, places like Taiwan and so on had already moved to the export industry base, which is a whole different story. Now we know that Great Leap Forward is probably the climax of this effort to continue to let agriculture provide its own infrastructure through organizational efforts and non-material incentives. And this really involved vast sacrifices on the part of the peasantry, including, I think, the blockage of exit from agriculture that the hukou system represented was part of the sacrifice. You had to sacrifice. You didn't have a chance for modernity, right? So this is this kind of productivity increases in collective agriculture, as we all know, was sort of hampered by free rider problems in collective agriculture. Although I think we forget, and I remember doing this in the 1970s, looking at time rates, piece rates, different times of time in piece rates, the scale of the team and brigade for providing a proper system of incentives while using collective agriculture. Anyway, it was decided that all of that stuff didn't work, and you're going to move to a whole different mode. In India, the early investment in agriculture and land reform reaches a limit. They're not beginning to see good returns. So Congress, and also it becomes difficult to move land reform any further because Congress is itself made of large landowners. In fact, it is called a party with a socialist head and a capitalist body, a conservative body, not necessarily a capitalist body. So the answer to India's agricultural production issue was, however, answered through global political economy. It was through the US food aid program, which in itself has a very interesting history. The US food aid program begins with the surpluses that came about in the New Deal, the massive agricultural surpluses because of US investments in agriculture. And by the 50s, 40s first, and 50s and 60s, this then becomes a very powerful resource for leveraging political status in the world, the US political status. And India becomes very much a recipient of this. So it's able to divert. So, in fact, you see here, world imports of grain from the United States, third world imports, grew from 19% of the world in the 40s to 50% from the 1950s to the late 60s. And so this does allow India to invest more in industry and give up on agriculture. Okay, so the second set of problems. Now then you do have, by the 67 or so, you have the Green Revolution in India. The Green Revolution in India is because the Indians realized that this kind of US aid is very much tied. And there was a particular episode when I think it was Shastri who was told that they had to vote against the Soviet Union or something like that. And otherwise there would be no more aid. And so that's when it realized that this aid was always tied to Cold War politics. And they began this Green Revolution. But Green Revolution is essentially intensive agriculture, right? The kind of agriculture that can destroy your land and so on. And it has its own set of problems. It does increase production and productivity, but it also involves heavy subsidies for inputs and minimum price supports. So in fact, these subsidies and minimum price supports amount to 2% of the total GDP in 1991. And this has been a huge drag a lot on the Indian state and its capacity. In two senses of the word. One is that, the financial drag. But the other thing is that this kind of subsidy system tends, because of the very poor delivery system in India, tends to benefit the richer people who don't need this kind of subsidy. I mean, subsidized electricity and so on, right? And it's never been able to sort of really get over that. So perhaps thus, to summarize for this section, industrial growth in China was enabled by transferring resources from agriculture while sustaining agriculture through organization, mobilization techniques. In India, aid and the Green Revolution allowed the state to focus its resources on industrial development. Much stagnation outside Green Revolution areas and new problems within the Green Revolution areas.